I'm Tarmi Mort. 3 weeks before my granddaughter's wedding, I found out there was a planning group chat. I wasn't in it. I discovered that by accident. I know it the setting destinedly. Claire was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. She was answering messages while eating a blueberry muffin. I wasn't paying attention until she laughed. Then she said, "Mom already decided that." I looked up. Decided what? The welcome baskets. I smiled. Oh, nobody asked me about those. Claire stopped chewing. For a second, she looked confused. Then she looked uncomfortable. I thought Mom told you. No. She stared at her phone. The room suddenly felt quieter. Not because anybody had done something wrong. Because Claire genuinely believed I already knew. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed again. The conversation moved on. Mine didn't. That evening, Diane stopped by my house, carrying 2 large folders. My daughter has always loved folders. School projects, church events, neighborhood fundraisers. Everything went into a folder. Now she was 54 years old and still carrying them. She placed both folders on my dining room table, the same table where family weddings had been planned for decades. She opened the first folder. Guest lists, vendor contacts, schedules, transportation plans. Everything was color-coded. Everything looked organized. "You're working hard," I said. Diane smiled. "Someone has to." I laughed. "I suppose that's true." She turned another page. We moved the florist meeting to Thursday. We? Me and Claire. Oh, I waited. Not for permission, not for approval, just for inclusion. Maybe a question, maybe an opinion, maybe a simple, "What do you think, Mom?" Nothing came. Diane continued turning pages. Every decision was already made, every box already checked. A few minutes later, Mark arrived. He sat down and started reviewing schedules. Diane explained everything. Transportation, hotels, seating, photography. Mark asked questions. Diane answered. Nobody looked at me. Nobody ignored me either. That was the strange part. I wasn't excluded. I simply wasn't needed. The conversation kept moving. I got up to refill my tea. Nobody noticed I had left the table. That bothered me more than it should have. The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was Claire's wedding, not mine. Of course, younger people would handle more of the planning. Of course, things changed. I spent the morning watering flowers and reading the newspaper. By lunch, I had nearly forgotten about it. Then the phone rang. I answered. A cheerful woman said, "Hello, is this Diane?" No. A pause. "Oh, I'm sorry. This is Eleanor." Another pause. Longer this time. The woman sounded confused, as if she had called the wrong person. "Oh, Mrs. Whitman." "Yes. We've been coordinating everything through Diane." I looked around my empty kitchen. I see. Could I speak with her? The planner didn't ask my opinion. She didn't ask a question about the wedding. She simply wanted Diane. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the phone. Not hurt, not angry, just surprised. A wedding planner was organizing my granddaughter's wedding, and somehow she expected Diane, not me. That evening I mentioned it. The planner called today. Diane looked up from her tablet. "Oh? She thought she was calling you." Diane laughed. "That's because she's been working with me. I figured. It's easier this way." There was that phrase, easier. For who? I almost asked. Instead, I nodded. The next few days brought more little moments. Small things, easy things, things nobody would ever call hurtful. I found out the rehearsal dinner menu had already been finalized. I learned that from Claire. I discovered the hotel welcome bags were ordered. I learned that from Mark. The transportation schedule was completed. I learned that from the planner. Every decision seemed to arrive after it was made. Never before. Always after. One afternoon, Claire came over to look through old wedding photographs. We sat together in the living room. Pictures covered the coffee table. Brides, grooms, family members who were gone now. People who once filled every room. Then Claire noticed a leather book inside the cabinet. The blessing book. I smiled. The old leather cover was worn smooth from decades of use. Every wedding in our family had used it. Every generation. Inside were names, dates, family blessings. Messages written by people long gone. I handed it to her. Claire carefully ran her fingers across the cover. I always loved this book. So did I. You'll do the blessing, right? That's usually how we've always done it. Claire smiled. Then her phone buzzed. The smile faded slightly. She glanced at the screen. What is it? Nothing. I waited. Claire hesitated. Then she said, Mom has some ideas. About the blessing? About everything. I laughed softly. Of course she does. Claire laughed too, but neither of us seemed completely comfortable. A few days later, I attended a planning meeting at Diane's house. The wedding planner was there. Claire was there. Mark was there. I arrived early, or so I thought. Everyone else was already seated. The planner stood near the dining table with a clipboard. She was reviewing schedules. Every few minutes she looked toward Diane. Not Claire, not me, Diane. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Then transportation came up. The planner looked at Diane. Diane answered, Hotel coordination. Diane answered, Family logistics. Diane answered. The planner never once looked in my direction. Near the end of the meeting, she asked about family traditions. For the first time all afternoon, I leaned forward. This was something I knew, something I had done for years. The planner checked her notes. Do we still want the traditional family blessing? Before I could answer, Diane spoke. We're discussing some alternatives. The planner nodded immediately, then moved on. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked at me. The conversation continued. And for the first time, I started wondering whether I was missing more than information. Because information wasn't the only thing moving through Diane. Attention was too. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped across the floor. People gathered their notes. The planner walked over to Diane. Not Claire, not me, Diane. They spent another 10 minutes discussing details near the kitchen counter. I couldn't hear most of it, but I noticed something. Whenever the planner had a question, she looked directly at Diane. Whenever Diane answered, the planner wrote something down. At one point, I walked over. The planner smiled politely. Mrs. Whitman. Then she immediately turned back toward Diane. The conversation continued. Without me. On the drive home, I replayed the afternoon in my mind. Not because anyone had been rude. They hadn't. That's what made it difficult to explain. If somebody had insulted me, I could have pointed to it. If somebody had excluded me on purpose, I could have pointed to that too. But nothing like that happened. Everyone was kind. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was trying to make the wedding successful. And somehow I still felt myself drifting toward the edge of the room. A few days later, Claire called. Grandma, are you home? I am. Can I stop by? Of course. She arrived carrying fabric samples. Bridesmaids' dresses. Table linens. Decor ideas. We spread everything across my dining room table. For an hour, things felt normal again. Claire asked my opinion. I gave it. She laughed at some of my stories. I teased her about spending too much money. For a little while, I felt like myself again. Then her phone rang. Diane, she said. Claire answered. I wasn't trying to listen. The conversation was impossible not to hear. Okay, pause. Okay. Another pause. Whatever Mom thinks is best. A few seconds later, she hung up. What happened? Claire smiled. Oh, nothing. I waited. She sighed. Mom changed the seating plan. The seating plan? Again, I looked down at the samples. Did you want it changed? Claire hesitated. That hesitation told me more than her answer. I don't know. Then why change it? Claire shrugged. Mom thinks it'll work better. I nodded. Nobody said another word, but I noticed something. Even Claire had stopped talking about decisions. She talked about Diane's decisions. The following Sunday, the family gathered after church. Claire and her fiancé were there. Mark was there. Diane was there. Several relatives stopped by. The wedding became the main topic of conversation. That was hardly surprising. What surprised me was how often people turned toward Diane. Questions about transportation. Diane. Questions about seating. Diane. Questions about vendors. Diane. Questions about schedules. Diane. At one point, a cousin asked about family traditions. I started to answer. Diane answered first, not intentionally, not aggressively, just faster. The conversation moved on before I finished my sentence. Nobody seemed to notice, except me, and maybe Claire. I caught her glancing toward me, only for a second. Then the moment disappeared. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in my kitchen. The house was quiet. The blessing book rested inside the cabinet across the room. I looked at it for a long time. Every wedding in our family had included it. Every generation. My mother had used it. Before her, my grandmother. Before that, people I never even met. The book wasn't valuable, not financially. Its value came from what it represented: continuity, family memory, a voice connecting one generation to the next. For years, that responsibility belonged to me. I suddenly realized nobody had mentioned the book in weeks. The next afternoon, Mark stopped by. He found me cleaning the front porch. Need help? No. He laughed. You always say that, because I usually don't. He grabbed a broom anyway. We worked together for a while. Then I asked something that had been bothering me. Do you think Diane is doing too much? Mark stopped sweeping. Only for a second. Then he started again. I think she's helping. I didn't say she wasn't. I know. The conversation could have ended there. Instead, Mark added something small. Diane just wants everything to run smoothly. I nodded. Because that was true. The wedding was running smoothly, maybe smoother than any wedding we'd ever had. The problem wasn't whether Diane was helping. The problem was that nobody seemed to notice how much authority came with helping. 2 days later, I discovered something else. Again, by accident. Claire came over after work. We sat together in the living room. She was showing me photos from a venue visit. She swiped through dozens of pictures, flowers, tables, lighting, centerpieces. Then she swiped too far. For one brief moment, a screenshot filled the screen. A group chat. Wedding Central. I recognized several names immediately. Claire, Diane, Mark, the planner, bridesmaids, relatives, the groom. Then the image disappeared. Claire quickly swiped away. Too late. We both knew I had seen it. The room became very quiet. I'm sorry, Grandma. For what? Her eyes dropped. The group chat. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I suddenly understood something. Important information wasn't accidentally missing me. It was being routed around me. Claire looked miserable. It wasn't my idea. I believed her. That made it worse. Because if it wasn't Claire's idea, then somebody else had decided it. And everyone else had accepted it. Mom said she didn't want you overwhelmed. There it was again. The explanation. The same explanation every time. Protection. Convenience. Efficiency. Help. Different words. Same result. I reached over and squeezed Claire's hand. It's all right. Different words. But neither of us really believed that. A few days later, a wedding schedule arrived in the mail, a professionally printed booklet, beautiful paper, elegant design. Everything looked impressive. I sat at my kitchen table and began reading. Welcome dinner, family breakfast, photography schedule, rehearsal, ceremony, reception. Every hour accounted for, every event organized, every role assigned. I read the booklet once, then again, then a third time. Something was missing. I couldn't immediately identify what. I turned the pages again, slower this time. Then I found it. Or, rather, I didn't. The family blessing wasn't listed anywhere, not once. No mention of it, no ceremony note, no tradition section, nothing. I closed the booklet, looked toward the cabinet. The blessing book sat exactly where it always had, untouched, waiting. For the first time since wedding planning began, I felt a chill of concern. Not because a tradition might disappear, because nobody had thought to ask me whether it should. And as I sat there staring at that old leather book, one uncomfortable thought settled into my mind. Maybe I wasn't simply being left out of conversations. Maybe decisions were already being made under the assumption that my answer wasn't necessary anymore. The next morning I called Claire. Not because I wanted answers, because I wanted to hear how she sounded. People often reveal more in their tone than their words. She answered on the second ring. Hi, Grandma. No. Good morning, sweetheart. We talked about ordinary things. The florist, the weather, the rehearsal dinner. Then I asked a simple question. Has anyone mentioned the family blessing lately? There was a pause, a small one, but I noticed it. Mom's been discussing different options. I looked out my kitchen window. The rose bushes needed trimming. I didn't realize there were options. Claire laughed softly. I guess there are now. I waited. She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. When we hung up, I sat at my table for a long time, not because I was upset, because I couldn't remember anyone ever discussing alternatives before. For years, the family blessing had simply been part of the wedding, like vows, like rings, like family photographs. Now it sounded negotiable. 3 days later, Diane hosted another planning meeting. The wedding was getting close. Everything felt more urgent, more organized, more structured. The planner arrived carrying 2 binders. Claire brought updated schedules. Mark carried coffee. I brought homemade cookies. The moment I walked in, I noticed something. Everyone had a role. The planner managed logistics. Claire handled guest communication. Mark coordinated transportation. Diane oversaw everything. I wasn't sure what my role was anymore. The meeting began. The planner reviewed timelines. People asked questions. Diane answered most of them. Then the planner asked about family arrivals. Before anyone else could respond, Diane handed her a printed sheet. The planner smiled. Perfect. The conversation moved on. No discussion. No confirmation, no second opinion. The answer already existed. 20 minutes later, the planner paused. I still need one primary contact for wedding day. I looked up. The room felt suddenly quiet. Nobody volunteered. Nobody discussed it. The planner glanced toward Diane, then wrote something down. No announcement, no vote. No decision I could point to, yet somehow it felt decided. After the meeting ended, Claire helped me carry things to my car. I waited until we were alone. Who's handling family questions during the ceremony? Claire adjusted a stack of folders. I think Mom is. You think? Everyone just assumes that. Everyone assumes. That phrase stayed with me. Nobody was officially giving Diane authority. Everyone simply behaved as though she already had it. The following afternoon, I stopped by Diane's house. I was returning a box of decorations. The front door was unlocked. Voices came from the dining room. I recognized Diane, the planner, Claire. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Then I heard my name. Will Eleanor be comfortable with all of this? The planner asked. Diane answered immediately. She'll be fine. No hesitation. No uncertainty. No need to ask me. The conversation continued. The planner accepted the answer. Claire accepted the answer. Everyone accepted the answer. I stood in the hallway for several seconds, listening, waiting for someone to say, "Let's check with her." Nobody did. Eventually, I walked into the room. Everyone smiled. Everyone welcomed me. Nobody seemed embarrassed. That was the unsettling part. From their perspective, nothing unusual had happened. That evening, I took the family blessing book out of the cabinet. The old leather cover felt familiar beneath my hands. I opened it slowly. Wedding after wedding, generation after generation, names, dates, messages, blessings, my mother's handwriting, my father's, my husband's, people who had guided our family for decades. I turned another page, then another. I suddenly realized something. Every entry represented trust, not authority, trust. The family trusted someone to carry the tradition forward. For years, that person had been me. The next day, Mark called. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Diane wants to know if you'll be at the venue by 3. I frowned. Why doesn't Diane ask me herself? Silence, then a small laugh. I don't know, but I did. Or at least I was starting to. It was easier for everyone if communication flowed through Diane, even when it involved me, especially when it involved me. The rehearsal dinner arrived 2 nights later. The restaurant was beautiful. Warm lighting, fresh flowers, white tablecloths. Family members filled the room. Everyone seemed excited. For most of the evening, things felt normal. Then small moments began stacking on top of each other. A cousin asked about transportation, Diane answered. An uncle asked about photography schedules, Diane answered. A family friend asked where guests should gather after the ceremony, Diane answered. Nobody looked around for another opinion. Nobody seemed to need one. At one point, a relative asked about family traditions. I opened my mouth. Diane answered before I could. The conversation moved on. I noticed Claire looking at me, only for a second. Then she looked away. Later, the planner approached our table holding a clipboard. Several family members gathered around. She reviewed the final schedule, arrival times, seating, photography order. Everything sounded organized. Then she paused. There is one detail left. She looked toward me. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. This was familiar territory. The planner smiled. Where should the family blessing take place? I started to answer. I'd spoken maybe 2 words. Then Diane gently interrupted. Mom doesn't handle that anymore. The sentence wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It sounded practical, reasonable, helpful even. The planner nodded immediately. Oh, all right. Then she turned toward Diane. What would you prefer? Nobody reacted. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked surprised. That was the moment that stayed with me. Not because Diane answered. She'd been answering for weeks. Because everyone accepted the answer as normal. The planner began discussing possible locations. Diane chose one, The planner wrote it down. The conversation continued, and I stood there listening to people discuss my family's tradition as though I were a guest, not the person who had carried it for years. A little later, Claire found me near the hallway. "Grandma?" I smiled. "I'm all right." But my voice sounded distant, even to me. The drive home felt longer than usual. I replayed the evening over and over. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't stop. The planner had asked about the family blessing, not transportation. Not flowers, not seating, the family blessing. And somehow I hadn't been the person who answered. The next morning, I opened the wedding schedule again, page by page, line by line. This time, I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was looking for patterns. The missing blessing, the group chat, the planner, the meetings, the assumptions. The conversations that happened around me, the decisions that reached me after they were made. One incident could be explained. 2 incidents could be coincidence. This was neither. That afternoon, I stopped by Diane's garage. Wedding decorations were everywhere. Boxes, signs, gift bags, centerpieces. Everything looked ready. Then I saw a large seating chart leaning against a table. I walked closer. Rows of names filled the board. Table assignments, family sections, wedding party placements. Eventually, I found my name. I stopped. Read it once, then again. My seat wasn't beside immediate family. It wasn't near Claire. It wasn't near Diane. It wasn't even in the front section. I stared at the chart, trying to understand. Mark walked over. "Everything okay?" I pointed. My seat changed. He glanced at the chart. Oh, just one word. No surprise, no confusion, as though he already knew. I looked back at the board, then at him, then back again. For weeks I had been telling myself there were explanations, reasonable explanations, helpful explanations, practical explanations. Standing there looking at my new seat assignment, those explanations began to feel much smaller, because people forget phone calls, people forget emails, people forget to include someone in a group chat. But moving someone's place inside a family event felt different. This wasn't information, this was position, and positions meant something. I stood there staring at my name. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether everyone else already knew who represented the family now. Everyone except me. The wedding morning arrived clear and warm. Sunlight filled my kitchen before 7. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Coffee, quiet, the familiar sounds of an old house waking up. Then I looked at the family blessing book resting on my table, and the feeling returned. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to uncertainty. I picked up the book and ran my hand across the worn leather cover. For decades, bringing it to a family wedding had been automatic. Nobody needed to remind me. Nobody needed to ask. The responsibility simply belonged to me, or at least it always had. An hour later, I arrived at the venue. The property sat on a stretch of countryside outside town. White tents, fresh flowers, rows of chairs waiting for guests. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed to know where they belonged. I carried the blessing book inside. Almost immediately, 2 young volunteers approached me. "Can we help you find your seat?" I smiled. "No, I'm family." They smiled politely. Then one of them nodded. "Oh, Diane's mother." I smiled again. They weren't wrong. Still, I noticed it. Not Eleanor, not Grandma, not the person who had carried family traditions for years. Simply Diane's mother, a small thing. But by then, I had learned that small things often meant more than they appeared to. Inside, the bridal suite buzzed with energy. Claire sat surrounded by bridesmaids, photographers, and curling irons. The moment she saw me, her face lit up. Grandma. She stood, and hugged me tightly. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The schedules, the planner, the meetings, the uncomfortable feeling that had followed me for weeks. Then she noticed the book. The blessing book. I smiled. Of course. For a brief second, something crossed her face. The same hesitation I had seen before. The same look she always wore when she knew more than she wanted to say. Then a photographer called her name. The moment vanished. Again. As the morning continued, guests began arriving. Family members filled the venue. The planner moved through the crowd with a clipboard. The florist approached Diane. The caterer approached Diane. A cousin approached Diane. A vendor approached Diane. Everywhere I looked, people seemed to know exactly who to ask. Nobody was told to go to Diane. They simply did. I stood near the ceremony entrance, watching it happen. Question, answer, decision. Question, answer, decision. The pattern repeated itself all morning. Not once did anyone stop and ask whether it had always been that way. Because by now, for everyone except me, it probably had. A little before the ceremony, I stepped into a quiet side hallway. The noise of the venue faded behind me. For the first time all day, I was alone. I looked down at the blessing book in my hands. The leather cover felt familiar, comforting, certain. Then I heard footsteps. The planner appeared around the corner carrying schedules and a headset. She smiled when she saw me. Mrs. Whitman, busy day. She laughed. You have no idea. Then she noticed the book. The blessing book. Yes. Wonderful. Something in her voice made me relax. Just a little. Finally, I thought. Something familiar. Something that still belonged to me. Then the planner glanced down the hallway, looking for someone. A moment later, Diane appeared. The planner's face brightened immediately. There you are. Everything happened quickly after that. The planner walked toward us. I instinctively held out the blessing book, the way I had done countless times before. She accepted it, smiled, then turned directly toward Deanne, without hesitation, without uncertainty, without looking back, and handed the book to her, not near her, not for a moment, not temporarily. She handed it to Diane. The planner looked relieved, as though she had finally found the right person. Then she asked, "So you'll be leading the family blessing?" For a second, nobody spoke. Diane held the book. The same book I had carried into every family wedding for years. The same book my mother once carried. The same book my grandmother once carried. Diane nodded. Yes. The planner smiled. Perfect. Then she added something that stayed with me. That's what I have in my notes. Not, would you like to? Not, are you handling it? Not, has anything changed? That's what I have in my notes. Meaning this wasn't a last-minute decision. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an accident. Someone had already told her. The role had already been assigned. The planner simply believed she was confirming it. Diane looked down at the book, then back at me. For the first time all day, she seemed uncertain. Mom, I looked at the book in her hands. Neither of us moved. The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Not because of what had happened, because of how normal it looked. No argument, no confrontation, no dramatic moment, just a question, an answer, and acceptance. That was all it took. The planner hurried away. The ceremony was about to begin. Diane and I remained standing in the hallway. She held the blessing book against her chest. I looked at it for a moment, then at her, then back at the empty hallway where the planner had disappeared. And for the first time, I realized this change had happened long before that morning. The hallway hadn't created it. The hallway had simply revealed it. Diane looked down at the book, then back at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said quietly, "Mom, I was going to talk to you." I nodded, because I believed her. She probably was. Eventually, after the schedules were finalized, after the ceremony was organized, after all the important decisions had already been made, the realization settled over me with surprising calm. Not because it didn't hurt, because I suddenly understood something. This hadn't happened in one day. It hadn't happened in that hallway. It hadn't even happened during wedding planning. The hallway had simply shown me something that had already been true for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Guests found their seats. Music filled the air. The crowd stood. Claire appeared at the end of the aisle. Beautiful, nervous, happy. The room softened around her. For a while, nothing else mattered. Not the planner, not Diane, not the blessing book, just Claire. The ceremony moved forward. Everything happened exactly as planned, because Diane had made sure it would, and when the time came for the family blessing, the planner stepped forward, holding the blessing book. She didn't look around. She didn't ask a question. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly to Diane, then placed the book into her hands. Several relatives immediately turned toward Diane, waiting, expecting, listening. An uncle stopped talking. A cousin lowered her phone. Even the planner stepped back. Everyone knew who was supposed to speak. Diane opened the book. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody seemed confused. Nobody looked toward me. And that was when Discovery Ba finally became clear. The authority transfer hadn't started in the hallway. The authority transfer had already happened. The planner knew it. The vendors knew it. The family knew it. Even Claire seemed to know it. I was simply the last person to understand. Diane began reading. The same blessing our family had used for years, the same tradition, the same book, the same words. Only the voice had changed. The family listened. The wedding continued. The tradition survived. Everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to, which was what made it so difficult. Nothing had broken. Nobody had failed. Nobody had taken anything by force. The system simply no longer required me. I sat quietly through the rest of the ceremony, watching, listening, thinking. Not about the book, not about the blessing, not even about Diane. I kept thinking about all the little moments that came before. The group chat, the planner, the schedules, the seating chart, the conversations, the assumptions. One by one, none of them seemed important. Together, they told the entire story. The authority had never disappeared all at once. It had faded. One helpful decision at a time. One practical choice at a time. One organized solution at a time. Until eventually nobody remembered asking me anymore. The reception began. Music drifted through the venue. People laughed. Children ran between tables. Photographers chased moments. Life continued exactly as it should. Several relatives stopped to talk with me. They hugged me, asked how I was doing, shared stories. Nobody treated me badly. Nobody ignored me. Nobody was cruel. In fact, most people were warmer than ever. That realization stayed with me too. My family still loved me. I never doubted that. What had changed was something else. For years, they needed my answer. Now they mostly needed my agreement, and sometimes not even that. Later in the evening, I stepped outside. String lights glowed above the patio. Music floated through the windows behind me. The air felt cooler, quieter. A few minutes later, Claire joined me. She sat beside me without speaking. For a while, we watched people dancing inside. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Grandma." I smiled. "For what?" She stared through the window. I should have said something sooner. I took her hand. No. She looked surprised. No? I shook my head, because suddenly I understood something she didn't. This wasn't her responsibility. It wasn't really the planner's either. And despite everything, it wasn't entirely Diane's fault. Families adapt. People step forward. People become dependable. The family starts calling them first, then asking them first, then trusting them first. And after enough time passes, nobody remembers when it started. Claire squeezed my hand. I love you. I know. And I did. There was never a moment when I questioned that. The pain wasn't losing my family's love. The pain was realizing that love had continued while authority quietly moved somewhere else. We sat together for a long time, watching the wedding continue, watching life continue, the same way it always does. A few months later, Diane returned the blessing book. She brought it to my house one afternoon. We had coffee together, talked about ordinary things. Weather. Family. Claire's honeymoon. Before she left, she placed the book on my kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us looked at it. Then she smiled. Thank you for trusting me. I looked at the book, then at her, and I realized something. The book had come back. The authority attached to it had not. Because authority doesn't live inside an object. It lives inside people's expectations, inside habits, inside who they turn toward when decisions need to be made. And those expectations had already changed. After Diane left, I placed the blessing book back inside the cabinet, exactly where it had always been. Then I stood there for a moment, looking at it, thinking about weddings, families, time, and how quietly authority can disappear, not through arguments, not through cruelty, not through betrayal, but through convenience, through trust, through people believing they are helping. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Feel free to share your experience in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I closed the cabinet door, turned off the kitchen light, and carried one final thought with me. They didn't take my place in one day. They just stopped asking me, one loving decision at a time.